Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, fans out there. This is Battlefield 1. In today's guide, we're going to be going over the Chamond Assault Tank. That is to say, we're going to be covering the different variants of the tanks available, which one you should be using for what situation, which one plays in which way, and which one is used best in certain scenarios, as well as, of course, how they compare to each other, and whether or not all of these are actually viable on the battlefield. With that being said, let's get straight into the first variant I wish to talk about in today's video, and that is the Field Package, or the Field Assault Tank Package. It comes with a 75mm main cannon, similar to what you would find on a heavy tank in practice. It also comes with so-called case shells. This is the kind of scatter shell, shotgun-like shell that you have as secondary to use against infantry. It is of course great against infantry in close quarter and medium range, usually one-shotting your target if your aim is not completely potato. However, when it comes to longer range or suppressive fire, you're of course very much limited because you won't be doing a lot of damage with this. It's got an emergency repair as essential kind of extra to go on with that, and its special ability, as I'm going to be calling it, is the Pigeon Carrier Artillery. This essentially calls in an artillery strike around and on the position of your tank. This takes about 4 or 5 seconds, in which you can't actually control your tank, but most infantry or armor in the area or vicinity of your tank will take damage, if not of course being outright killed. This can be useful as kind of last-ditch effort if the tank's going to die anyway and you just want to get that cheeky kill in before it does, or of course for clearing points on conquest and operations. It should be said, however, it's relatively tricky to use and of course disables your tank's movement and the driver's guns and weapons for that period when you're carrying out that strike, which means of course you're relatively vulnerable to any kind of incoming fire or grenades from enemy artillery, enemy tanks, and of course enemy assault players. With that being said, one more point to note about that is that your secondary gunners or your other people in the tank who have of course access to LMGs, they can continue firing while doing so. Another point to point out with this tank is that its essential front gun, the front LMG, is not of course accessible to the driver. You as driver have access to the case shells. This is controlled by a separate seat which essentially has the same view as you do as driver of the tank, which allows for a degree of teamwork regarding at least the frontal part of the tank, relatively similar to what you had in Battlefield 4, where you had of course a gunner that was very much responsible for taking out infantry targets in front of you as well. With that being said, let's move on to the second tank, the Gas Assault Package. Now this comes with a 75mm air burst shot, which means the shot that you fire has to first ricochet or bounce off any kind of surface and will then explode, which is of course great if you're trying to take out infantry behind cover. However, not very good if you're trying to take out tanks, because it can of course bounce off a tank and bounce away from it, reducing the amount of damage the necessary tank takes. It's also not good for taking infantry out precisely that are not necessarily behind cover, but simply prone, for example with a rocket gun on a ledge or further out in the distance, because not only does this shot have increased drop compared to your normal primary 75mm cannon found on the Field Assault Package, but of course because it bounces means that it's very difficult to place it extremely precisely enough to actually hit a small target such as an assault player up on that mountain using his rocket gun. With that being said, its secondary weapon is much of the same. That is to say, it's specialized at taking infantry out or damaging infantry behind cover and in close quarters, because you have gas shells that you shoot. However, once more, the problem is if you actually have an assault player running directly at you, you're in trouble trying to take him out, because of course your primary weapon isn't necessarily great at doing so, and your secondary weapon, especially in the case of assault players, is completely useless. You do 15, 20, 30 damage. He'll then put on his gas mask and then is no longer affected by the gas effects of your gas shell. Now the tank comes with some interesting special abilities as well. Much like the assault package, it comes with an emergency repair, and it also comes with a gas emitter. You can find this on some of the heavy tank variants as well. This tank is specialized around gas and infantry killing, is however in my opinion not only extremely vulnerable as consequence to this to enemy armor, but extremely vulnerable to certain scenarios in which infantry can take advantage of your limited weaponry, which means technically you would have to be 100% reliant in certain situations on gunners to take out enemy infantry. And this is of course why, much like you have on the Field Assault Tank, your front LMG is controlled by your secondary gunner, which is great if you're working together with teammates on comms. Not so great if you're in your usual public lobby playing a solo game or your teammates aren't in that tank, because at least in my experience I have found gunners in tanks usually to be a bunch of unreliable, incapable people. That's just my experience at least. With that being said, let's move on to the third variant variant of the assault tank, the Standoff Assault package. It comes, much like the Field Assault package, with a 75mm main explosive shot. However, you don't have a scatter shot or case shell as secondary here. You have access to the LMG that usually your secondary gunner would have. That secondary gunner position doesn't exist on this tank, which means that the Standoff Assault tank can actually only carry 3 instead of 4 passengers, which means the total tank is 4 people instead of normally 5 when it comes to the assault package. This has advantages and disadvantages. If you're working in a squad or working with a teammate on comms, it means essentially your damage output against infantry is lower than comparable with the Field Assault package. However, in the more frequent situation where your teammate or even the person on comms is not necessarily in your tank or in that position, you as driver have better control over your anti-infantry capabilities and are not limited to close medium range, but can also put down some good suppressive fire with your LMG at longer range and can simply take on more infantry at a time. This is something I find usually limits the performance of the heavy tank, of the land ship, and of course also this tank, the assault package, at least in the case of the field tank, is yes, you can use your primary shot to take out armor and to take out infantry, but in many games of operations there's a huge amount of infantry and you simply can't shoot through them fast enough before they get a chance to notice your position, take you out, or you simply run out of ammunition. In the case of the Standoff Assault, you can basically use both your primary and secondary weapon as driver to take out infantry, which increases your effectiveness massively, because while your primary shot reloads, you can be using your LMG to soften up the next guy or take out another person and then switch back to your primary back and forth, essentially putting a consistent, almost unlimited amount of damage on enemy infantry. That's not to say, of course, you're limited here to only infantry targets. Much like the Field Assault package, much like really any heavy tank, this is a very capable weapon, a very capable tank to deal damage to enemy armor with. It comparably plays much like you would a heavy tank in this scenario. Your main cannon is used against armor. Another thing to note about this tank is that its special ability is relatively unique to tanks in that it has a spotlight searchlight, something you can also find on the bomber. Essentially, you press this and it takes somewhat of a picture of what you're looking at the time and spots all the enemy infantry and armor. Great if you're trying to push up on a point on operations and there's a lot of enemy infantry hiding around behind cover and it's difficult to see their small little heads popping off. This not only helps you as driver in identifying which targets you should be taking out first, but it also helps your gunners and your fellow teammates because everything is spotted. They have a lot easier time seeing the enemy, and snipers will love to take advantage of this feature as well. Your last but not necessarily very useful ability is to, of course, throw out a smoke screen. This is also an ability you'll find on a heavy tank. It allows you for a quick escape in certain scenarios. I don't personally find it to be too useful, and certainly not really a valid replacement for the quick repair which you would have on something like the Field Assault package or the Gas Assault package. Having then covered the basic 3, how do you play these effectively, and are they actually effective in the first place? Well, from what I've said, I think it's relatively obvious that the Gas Assault package is not one I enjoy. There's hardly any footage of it in today's video. I couldn't get comfortable with this tank. I find it too ineffective because in Battlefield 1, almost in every single game as tank driver, you have to not only face infantry at all engagement distances because of the AT rocket gun, which this tank is not capable at doing, and you also have to face armor targets, and this tank is not good at taking out armor targets either. Its limited abilities really only pertain to a game like Conquest on Amiens, where you're clearing lots of buildings and gas can be useful, but even then, frankly, I would prefer the normal assault package or something like a light tank because I just feel more effective all around, both against enemy infantry and enemy armor. However, the Field Assault package and the Standoff Assault package are both two very interesting additions to Battlefield 1's tank arsenal, and I think both need to be played in a certain way to be most effective. The Field Assault package, in my opinion, has the most potential here. That is to say, it has the potential to be most lethal in pretty much all situations. However, to do that, you truly do require a gunner who's on point and, in the best case scenario, also on comms with you, because you are not capable of putting out so much damage on that vital enemy infantry, which you usually have to do, than you are with something like the Standoff Assault Tank. If you're a solo player, then the Standoff Assault Tank is the better version. Now, why the Field Assault package, besides the fact that you've got 2 people basically controlling your main anti-infantry weapons, is a better version over the Standoff Assault Tank if you have that teamwork, is because, well, your special ability is actually relatively useful as well and can net you that few kills. And in a kind of clutch last-minute scenario on an operations where you're trying to take that last point, this can make the difference between winning and losing. And never forget that this tank is played similar to a heavy tank in that if it's fully staffed, you can suddenly become a moving fortress of death on an actual objective point. When it comes to the Standoff Assault Tank, this is a tank that's better suited to stay a little bit away from the objective. Not necessarily as much as an artillery truck, because of course you still have your side gunner positions, and if your tank is fully staffed, much like with the heavy tank, you can become very effective on an objective, but its abilities are geared more towards, I'd argue, the long-range solo snipe tank. Not camping, but certainly a little bit further away from the frontline action. And this is because not only do you have this spotting ability, which is of course better used at longer ranges, because then you see more people, you spot more people. Simply spotting 3 people right in front of you in the building 10 meters ahead of you is not going to really be useful. That. Secondly, of course, your primary weapon and secondary weapon being controlled by one individual suits that playstyle more than necessarily all your weapons being controlled by 2 or 3 people at the same time. And of course, well, the smoke allows you to get a quick escape from behind cover, which is more useful in my opinion at longer ranges than in close quarters, because in close quarters, the smoke doesn't do enough to really hide your position. People still know roughly where you're at, unless you can get out of dodge very quickly. With that being said, when it comes to the rest of how you play this tank, it's relatively similar to those people who know how to play a heavy tank. If you haven't seen my guide on the heavy tank, I'll leave it down below in the description for you to find, in case you've got any remaining questions regarding some basic tank tactics for this tank. I, for my part, love both the standoff version and the field version. However, in the cases where I don't have a buddy to go tanking with me, I definitely recommend you choose the standoff version, and where you do have a friendly force in that tank that you can actually rely on, definitely go for the field version in my opinion. Now, with all that being said, I'd like to hear about your experiences with the Chamond Assault Tank down below in the comments, as well as necessarily if you have a favorite variant or find one variant to be clearly better than another one, as well as of course your usual video suggestions for Battlefield 1 videos. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.